This webinar is the second of a series and is part of our communication campaign, Achieve Better Milk Together. At Vetoquinol, we aim at working hand in hand with stakeholders to achieve more for vets and farmers and cows and consumers, which means healthier cows and herds, a better quality of life, and supporting sustainability of milk production. Beyond products, we are aiming at providing solutions helping to solve your and your farmers' pains. In mastitis treatment with diagnostics and fit-for-purpose protocols, in mastitis prevention with products and management tools, and partnership in data management to help you provide attractive services. Our topic today is understanding the importance of bacteriology in mastitis management. Our speakers, Sophie Piepers from M-Team at Ghent University in Belgium, researcher and teacher, passionate about mastitis and milk quality, with a high capability of turning scientific knowledge into practice, and Joep Driessen from Cow Signals, a company providing very technical and practical trainings for farmers and vets. Joep will bring you into the farm and make you ask you the right questions. Then Joep, you have 20 minutes, the floor is yours. I need to stop sharing.
Excellent. Well, guys, I'm very excited. We have 200 people right now in the webinar. That's really good, from all over Europe. So I'm really thrilled that we have so many colleagues joining this webinar. And today we're going to talk about the number 2 point of the udder health diamond, and that is actually infectious pressure. How do you lower the pressure? I always say, well, the Miss Udder Health has a head, which is she is in control. She's using her head for being in control. She's using her 2 hands to find out the balance between infectious pressure and resistance. So we want to really lift up the resistance of the cows, and not of the bacteria, but of the cows, the resistance. And we want to lower the infectious pressure. So we want to have less pressure from bacteria and infections. So that's actually the challenge. And now we have 2 legs. Miss Udder Health has 2 legs, and that's her milking and her treatment leg. So that's the 2 things to come on the next session. So today, how do you lower infection pressure? Well, first a question, and you might already put some remarks in the Q&A box, because then I can see them. If you use the Q&A box, I'd like you to type in 5 things that you see. What do you see here on this cow? And there's at least 5 disaster points here that makes the infection pressure go up. And and what is your best guess? I think most of you have seen the flies. If you look very carefully, you see the flies here. You also see leaking milk, and you see very dirty hooves, and there's some straw sticking on the hooves, but there's some manure there, really close to the teat end. And so the dirty hooves, the dirty udder, the manure on the udder, not having any bedding there. So then you know that. Babette Oliver, she already typed in manure, flies, and laying down. Yeah, laying down is a good thing, but laying down in the wet spots is not really good. So please feel free to type in remarks in the Q&A. I always like to have direct response from people. So feel free to do so, and you can also type in questions there. But this is actually a poor bed with no filling, or with very, very little straw on the concrete where the cow is resting. And well, in this case, things are going really wrong. Some people say, that's an interesting question also maybe for Sophia. Is it true that we have more cows leaking milk on mattresses than on deep beds? And I think probably not. Well, on a deep bed, they are more comfortable, and yes, probably will have a little bit less milk leakage, but on a mattress, you see it better. So is there really more leaking on a deep bed? I think it depends very much on the discomfort of the cow, that she starts leaking milk on a hard surface, that she has a lot of pressure on her udder. And of course, if you don't milk her every 8 hours or every 12 hours, you have more trouble. Then the other big risk factor is actually this one here, and this is called slurry. I always talk a lot about hoof signals in my trainings, and the hoof signals. There's two reasons. There's two risks for hoof damage, and that's actually for infectious hoof diseases. And today we're talking about udders. How does the bacteria go in this udder? But actually, the slurry first comes here down at the hoofs, and sometimes the whole lower leg is covered in manure. And this is what we call the shit tsunami. And I'm not supposed to say shit in international webinars, so I'm gonna call the manure or slurry. It's the S word, but it's actually the slurry, the mix of urine and manure, which is very bad for the hoofs. And if the slurry is sticking on the hoofs, you also have the risk for mortellaro, here a very serious disease that is diminishing the resistance of the cow. And the other thing is that you have the udders getting dirty. So if the legs are very dirty, then the udder can actually touch directly on the leg, and then you can have a direct infection. So slurry is bad, and also the other risk factor here is actually the mattress. You see the mattress, and this is not too bad. They put some straw on it, but it's also not too good. I told the last time already that I think mattresses should be banned from the world, because cows are not resting enough on mattresses. That is really compromising their general resistance. So if you want to have healthy cows, you should have deep beds. And that's a big discussion. Another question also for Sophia, the green bedding. Here some farmers having like tremendous results with it, very low cell count, and some farmers going through the roof with their cell counts with the same dry manure bedding system. So that's interesting to think about. What is then a success factor? And also in Berlin, the farms with the highest and the lowest cell count had straw limestone mattresses. The highest and the lowest ones in the benchmark were all deep beds. And the difference was, of course, clean beds or dirty beds. But you can have a deep bed with excellent results, but if you don't keep it clean, you are in trouble. But the same with mattresses, and you want to have them long enough and clean enough and dry enough. So if you look at these two things, dirty, wet, and then slurry on the feet is two big risks. So what can you do? Well, one of the things is if you make a V scraper, a V, I see if I can design it here, a V, then the cow can step over the scraper clean in this corner, because then the slurry is normally in the middle of the V scraper. So then a V scraper is actually a benefit for cows, because they can escape the manure tsunami, because this is really bad for hoofs infections and other infections. So that's one thing. The other thing, what you can do, sand bed is the best. Jorge asking the question. The best is sand, because that has the best drainage. And if you have leaking milk, like here, you don't find it back. And what you see after about 10 years, 10 to 15 years, they take away the last meter of the sand beds. They clean it out because it's saturated with dirt. So also sand beds need thorough cleaning after 10 years normally, because they get really packed with bacteria. So you have to keep a dry top layer, but if the lower layer is very dirty, it's probably time to take out the last meter of your bed. Sand beds are far the best, because then the milk is draining down and the hoofs are cleaner. And the biggest thing about sand is that the cows can actually walk easier. So they go 12 meals a day instead of 6 meals a day. So they have a better general resistance. But if you look at infection pressure, it's actually quite interesting. We have the milk parlor and we have the beds. And actually, why do they get an infection? Because bacteria are going in this canal here. And it can come from resting in the bed in the dirt, and it can come from the milking parlor. So the beds and the humid air is one factor, and the other factor is the milk and the hands of the milkers. We used to say environmental and contagious. That's still the case, but we're not 100% sure sometimes which bacteria is what, because there's quite a few different strains, and that's Sophie's specialty, and that's really interesting to find out more about it. But actually, Contagious mastitis is you spreading it with a dirty towel. That's what happens here. Or even with the teeth cups, or not wearing good washable gloves, you spread more bacteria in the milk parlor. And this is actually the clean hooves and the clean beds. And the last one for the environment, very fresh air and ventilation. So, how do you lower it? The infection pressure is actually very simple. You have to really put at least 1 meter per second airflow in the building. 1 meter per second, and that is actually year round, okay? And you need, on every place in the barn, you need 1 meter per second airflow, preferably across the building or over the length of the building, but the wet air should be pushed out the building and the dry air should be pushed in. And in a heat stress moment in the south of Europe, and I know there's a lot of people from warmer countries as well than the Netherlands. Even in the Netherlands, we see that we have 6 months, 7 months, fans turning to get some fresh air, even in the early spring and the late autumn, like today, where it's 14 degrees, we still already, the fans are running sometimes. 15, 16 degrees, we like to have the fans running. So in the heat stress countries, you like to go for 3 meters per second. This is a extreme important thing, and if you don't have any fans in the building, you probably don't have enough air, because at least 8 or 10% of the time we have no wind, and if there's no wind, you have no clearance of your building. So that's really a big bottleneck in many farms, because they think fans is a luxury, but I would say fans is a must, especially if you go for deep bedding systems. You really want to have the top layer of your bed as dry as possible, because that is really preventing mastitis. Today I was on a 400 cow dairy, very interesting, and they had 270,000 cells for the last 2 years, and they were really struggling to get lower. And so there was a lot of issues we discussed already today. So if you look at the bacteria, again, it's more like the science part, but we have these bacteria, you can read them, you probably heard about them. The Staphylococcus aureus is a very bad contagious one that easily can go by the hands of the farmer. And if one teeth cup is contaminated with this Staph aureus by one cow, the next 6 cows can be contaminated with the same teeth cup, because the bacteria is hanging in the inside of the teeth cup, and the next 6 cows being milked, 5, 6 cows, can also pick up this bacteria. So that's quite interesting, that you have to work clean, and what can you do to prevent that? But you have to first know which cows have it. The uterus is on both pictures. This is all the bacteria that are spread by the milker and by the hands. And this one is actually spread by the. These ones are spread by the in the barn. These are mainly. Hey, there's a mistake. These are mainly environmental. Excuse me. These are the environmental ones. Oops, correction right away. Environmental bacteria, because these are actually happening in the barn. And here it comes to very, very good clean beds and clean floors and clean air. So you really have to do your utter best to keep the building clean. And this is very difficult. And this is what is the difference between top farmers and average farmers. They are working very hard on the beds. And they can do that because they have more healthy cows and less sick cows to treat. So they can do a better job and spending more time in cleaning beds. So the average farmer, now the top farmers, they go 4 times a day. Cleaning the beds, 1 time thoroughly, and the other 3 times quickly take out, like this man below here, take out some manure. At noon, before you go for your lunch, you quickly make a quick round in the barn, and that's the 3rd cleaning round. If you do a 3rd cleaning round, you can drop your cell count easily 30,000 cells. If you do another evening cleaning round, the robot farmers normally go another round before they go to bed at 9 or 10 o'clock. They do a quick round and they just go between the cows. They take also some manure pads out. So that's like a 22 o'clock cleaning. And most people do only morning, evening. But if you do a 3rd cleaning round and a 4th cleaning round, amazingly, you drop the amount of cells hugely. So the strep uterus is happening in the straw yards, but it's also happening in the parlor. You see it's on both lists here. That's an interesting bacteria that can do funny things. That you don't like, but straw packs can be very good and very clean if the top layer is dry. But if there's a lot of humid in there, then it looks still yellow from the top, but if it's moisturous and you lay down on your knees in the straw, it's bad news. One of the Dutch public health specialists, Officer Saint-Pimon, was telling me you have to take off your clothes, roll naked in the straw yard, and if there's no straw sticking on your body, then it's the straw yard is okay. I'm not sure you have to be completely naked, but it was quite a nice statement that your straw yard should be clean and dry, and it should be not too warm and not too much bacteria growing underneath there. So then we have the hygiene score, and we can see where we are. And this is really interesting because here you can very quickly see what your cows are trying to tell you. Right? The number 1 and 2s are excellent. They're only light damage, but the 3 and 4s, you really bring up the risk a lot higher. Now you see this is a slatted floor. On slatted floors, we have normally a bit cleaner legs, and the whole legs are a bit cleaner. But on the closed flooring systems, you get quite a bit of manure on the cows. If you see the manure on this cow, it's quite interesting on the back side of the legs, then you can suspect there's also diarrhea. So if the cows are very loose with the manure, you see the manure packed on the back side of the legs, it tells you there's probably quite a bit of manure, thin manure and diarrhea, and that is also a risk factor, of course, for more other health issues. Also dirty spots from laying in straw yards, and some cows are laying in the middle of the barn. So a little bit about the beds. The green bedding, I already told you, it can be perfect and it can also be pretty poor. So if you take green beds, if anybody has questions or remarks on green beds, let me know right away in the chat. But I'm telling you that 36% is probably the maximum that good separators do. So you have a machine, it squeezes out the water, you have 36% dry matter from a good separator. But that's not good enough. You want it to be as quickly as possible. It should go up to 60% dry matter. So how do you reach that? Also today, I said to the farmer, well, you have to cut out all the risks. I want you to do every hour scraping, not every 2 hours, or maybe even every half hour to get more manure out of the barn. It was a closed floor system. And I want you to put the fans on when you put bedding in. If you put bedding in, you put immediately the fans on, also in the winter time. Cows go milking, you fill the beds, you turn the fans on, you dry the top layer very quickly. And you see this top layer, you see it a little bit wet here in this part. This was of course the selection area, so it was not so well filled here. And if you look carefully, you see the floor here underneath, but you also see that it's quite a bit humid. And then what can you do? Well, the best thing you can do is 3 times a week raking with a simple rake with only a few fingers, 4 fingers on a rake, the last meter of the beds. You rake it and you fill it with 1 or 2 centimeters new material. That's the best management practice. With 3 times a week, you end up with amazing results. We saw this on Hoheluco in Germany, a top managed farm, where they came from sand beds and they went back to green bedding because of environmental reasons. But now they realized that weekly sand bedding was perfect, but weekly green bedding was not good enough. He had too many cell counts. So then he went everyday green bedding. He said, that's a lot of work, but now I'm back on my own cell count again. And then he said, well, wait a minute, I can also start raking. So now he does 3 times a week raking and filling. And now he's better than before with sand. That's quite interesting. So every system can be managed to what is needed. And that's a top manager. What the top manager is doing, they manage the system that they have to the max. And that means if you choose for green bedding, you have to go 3 times a week, raking and filling to get the optimum results. And even if you fill it only once a week and 3 times raking, that's all the farmers do that, once a week filling, 3 times raking, less work. It can still work perfectly, but then if you fill it once a week, you have to put in maximum air. So you have to put fans up in the barn. Yeah, well, this is a Dutch barn, typical Dutch barn. I showed you in the last presentation. It's a sand-bedded barn, top quality barn, and there's no fans here. And he's sort of getting away with it. It's in the Netherlands, but really it's very open in the field, but there's still 8% of the days when you don't have wind. So you can get even better results with some extra fans here, and you can choose for a vertical fan here that makes a lot of air movement. But very often we also put some horizontal fans along the wall, along the length here, along the wall, and then we blow the air in this direction. We hang them above the feed fans here, right above the feed fans, and we blow them in here. So typically this fan will do roughly 12 meters, and then you end up here. And then we put the next fan up here, blow it for these 3 cubicles. And now we have every cow a cool bed, and that's really important that the beds are cooled, but also dried. The top layer should be dry. Okay, so dry the beds to have less bacteria in the resting area, and also you dry the floors. So even with 1 row of side fans and 1 big hovercraft here in the middle, then you can have like quite a bit of turbulence that all the cows experience a 3 meter circulation air. And we see if you blow in air from this side, then you can still have the air going out and the smoke out this side. We do a lot of smoking tests, and we see that it can work. But the best thing is actually 2 rows of fans blowing the air cross through the building. Fresh air is highly misunderstood and highly underestimated. And here also we see that we need at least quite a few fans to blow the air out of the building. I want to have this wall and these doors open to have maximum airflow. And also in the winter we need airflow, and that's what we see in Russia and very cold climates where they close the barns, very humid. We still need to ventilate. Also in Canada, -40. I said you have to open the barn for at least an hour in the afternoon or half an hour that you get the wet air out. Just if you have only 1 clearance per day, you still have a lot less humidity. Remember that every cow is drinking 100 liters of water, only producing 30 liters of milk. So that's 70 liters per cow that is coming in the system. 70 liters per cow, 70. So that's why airflow is amazingly important to reach. So a few more things for the milk parlor. What do you do in the milk parlor? Well, very simple, guys. Clean udder, healthy teats, clean towel, clean gloves, and clean teat cups. You see the guy here washing out the teat cups. It can be done manual, very easy. It's just a good habit, especially after a Staph aureus cow, that you know that she's high cell count. Then you put a tape around her or you mark her, and then you wash out these teat cups. Otherwise, you might have 5 or 6 other cows being contaminated. So some people have automatic systems there, but how can you keep the udder clean? Well, that's mainly having the beds clean, and of course, how can you keep the teats healthy? That's milk techniques. There's not too much vacuum and the right size of the teat cups. A clean towel, very important. Clean gloves that you can wash your own hands very easily and not bacteria sticking on it. And clean teat cups. So last question is actually the operating procedures. I was today on a farm where they had 12 different milkers, and they had this machine, this automatic brush machine. Canada, I think it comes, or Italy, I'm not sure. It's a brush machine with brushes and handheld where you can do 4 teats in 5 seconds, and then you can do with water and without water. Well, there's a bit of discussion if we should do it with water. Another question for Sophie on the end. Should we use this prep machine with water? And today the guy was spreading a lot of water to the udder and he didn't dry it off, and then he started clustering the cows. And I think, hey, that's quite a risk factor for high cell count and for mastitis. He only had 100 cases on 400 cows, 25% mastitis per year. But in the meantime, his cell count was going, ticking the 300. And I think that's just too much. So I recommended him, do what this guy does in this picture. Just do for 2 months dry prepping and see what happens. But he said it was a bit too much bedding hanging on the udders all the time. So that's why he started pre-dipping and then brushing it off. But then he forgot to wipe it off. That was too much work. So it's also adding milk time, and that's also a risk factor for standing too much. So summarizing this guy here, there's one risk factor here. Is just water after Staph aureus is enough? Martin Bleuming is asking me. Good question. That's a question for Sophie as well. Write it down, Sophie. But it's actually it helps as if all the water milk rests are out. Probably that's already enough. We have also a lot of farms with air wash, just blowing all the tubes and the teat cups empty with water and air, and that really drops the risk factor. So yes, if you wash out milk, it can help already a lot, and you don't have to disinfect it. Some people take 80 degrees water and they let it hang in the 80 degrees water and slurp it through the system, so that they wash it out with hot water. That's of course even better as steam cleaning, but even cold water can do a great job. And one little mistake from this guy is actually the clean ones are down here, you see, and the dirty ones are in here. But if now a cow is defecating just before the gutter, you can have like manure falling here in here easily. So that I like this to be standing a bit up higher, and there you have even cleaner towels. But a very good system from every cow a clean towel. And this was not a system. The guy said I dropped my cell count with 150 cells by prepping, pre-foaming, and then drying off. So a very good prep in the barn. And he was having this simple tool here to wash out the teat cups. That's just a little bit easier than the guy doing it here with his normal hose. And you automatically, quite fast, you can clean the whole teat cup out with right in the middle spray of water that you take the most of it out. Okay, guys, this was the infection pressure, so I better stop quickly now, and we go to Sophie. Sophie, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joop. Great presentation again. And now we'll leave the floor to Sophie. Please, Sophie.
Thank you very much. You can see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Good evening, everybody. So in the next 20 minutes, I like to inspire you on how to implement diagnostics in other health management, and you've already explained part of it. So let's go ahead. Three items, different techniques. I just want to touch upon those techniques. I don't want to go in too much detail, but just give some examples, the practical implementation, and then some take-home messages. Let's start with the different techniques. The easiest one is, of course, standard bacteriological culturing. It's also the cheapest method, by which you use a kind of blood agar. On that blood agar, gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria will grow, yeast will grow, fungi will grow. So a large range of germs that can cause mastitis will grow on the blood agar, and then it's often combined with a more selective agar plate like McConkey, on which only gram-negative bacteria will grow. Of course, it takes 24 up to 48 hours. In case of E. coli, it might already be visible after 12 hours, but let's say 24 up to 48 hours, depending on the germ you want to identify. And we need an incubation at 37 degrees. Of course, besides that, you can also make use of more selective agar plates, because then it's also easier. You need less tests to come to the final diagnose. And for example, on the right side, you see Vetorapid. That's also a selective agar. You have the three sectors. One sector on which only gram-negative bacteria will grow. Then we have one sector on which only staph will grow, staph species. And then we have one sector on which only streptococci species will grow. And then with color changes, for example, in the gram-negative sector, you can also make differences between E. coli and other non-E. coli coliforms. You can also see or get an indication whether it's Staph aureus compared to non-aureus staphylococci. So they allow for a quick diagnose as well. And as you can see, there are many other options available around the world that make use of these selective agar plates. Then MALDI-TOF MS, that's of course not an instrument to put in a vet practice, although we see that more and more labs, professional labs, are equipped with MALDI-TOF. And I put it here in this slide because it relates to culturing. So in case of MALDI-TOF, you still need a culture result. So you still need the colonies, but the reading and the identification, that will be done automatically by the MALDI-TOF system. And as you can see, it works with a laser, and the laser will charge the proteins of the colonies and of the bacteria, and then based on the speed by which they reach the detector, they can have different spectra, different patterns for different bacteria. So it's really specific pattern for each bacteria when they look at the speed by which the different molecules reach the ion detector. It's an objective reading, so it's based on a library that is into the system. So it's more objective than just standard bacteriological culturing. But again, you still need a culture result. So you're still having that 24 hours to incubate and to come up with some colonies. Then we have also, for example, tests like Mastitis, because many companies are looking for a test that is quick, that is good, that can be used on farm, that also is easy to use and to have a more objective reading and identification of the bacteria compared to standard bacteriological culturing. And this is one of those systems. So 4 bacteria can be identified, especially also the distinction between gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria is very good. And very nice is also that here in this system you have the minimal inhibitory concentration values for 3 antibiotics. So the results are available after 24 hours. You don't need to have any knowledge about bacteriological culturing and testing. No, the reading is done automatically based on color changes and using an algorithm. And next week or this week, I think it will also be launched in France, for example. So by Vetoquinol, if you have any questions, I'm quite sure you can find experts there that can tell you everything about it. Then we have the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction. There we will not identify the bacteria itself. We will identify DNA of the bacteria. So they will replicate the DNA strains that are present in the milk sample. Those strains that can come from infected milk, so from bacteria that are present in milk, but it's of course also possible that you will detect DNA from the environment, from the hands, from the teeth skin. Nobody knows. So it's not the bacteria that you will identify, but really the DNA that will be detected. And the higher the amount of DNA that is present in the initial sample, the lower the number of replicate cycles they need to identify DNA, to detect the DNA. So if you have a low number of cycles, then it means that the initial concentration was already high, that we had a lot of DNA of that specific bacteria. And if we have a lot of cycles, if we need a lot of cycles to detect the DNA at a certain amount, then it means that we had a low initial concentration in the milk sample. But here we will not detect the bacteria themselves, it will be DNA of bacteria. Now, currently, today, there is also an Acumen detection system from the US, the United States. That's a PCR technique that can be used on farm. In Belgium, we have actually nowadays 2 vet practices that are trying it, that are using it in practice to see the performance and how it works. So on farm or in clinic, the positive or the highest benefit of PCR is that you have a fast result, as you don't need culturing. It's detecting DNA, so you have a result in 3 hours. And the PCR kits that are available is for detection of staph species, detection of strep species, and then Staph aureus strep uterus, so in one kit, and then Mycoplasma and Prototheca in another kit. So this is something, I have no scientific data today on sensitivity, specificity, or whatsoever, but as you can see, quite some companies are looking for a system that is easy to use and that can give quick results on farm. So that just to give you an overview. Now, bacteriological culturing or PCR, what do we prefer? Well, it depends also on what you like to do. I will talk about that in the next section. But just to give you some differences, first of all, in case of bacteriological culturing, especially if you use the non-selective agar plates, you will find and be able to identify a large range of bacteria. Of course, if you use selective agar plates like Vetorapid, then the range will be smaller. But in general, bacteriological culturing, you have a large range of bacteria. In case of PCR, it's of course restricted to the primers, to what is possible, what is included in the kit. If you want to replicate DNA, you need the primers that are present. And if a certain primer of a certain bacteria is not present, then you will not be able to detect DNA of that particular bacteria. So mycoplasma in bacteriological culturing, that takes a bit long. You also need special conditions. In real-time PCR, you will have an immediate identification, so that's easier. So experiences, there we see a difference as well in test interpretation, especially if you have standard bacteriological culturing, you need some experience. The sensitivity is also a bit lower, so more false negative results in case of bacteriological culturing. Then especially also the turnaround. When do I have my results? When the sample enters the lab, when do I get a result? So that will be 24 to 48 hours in case of bacteriological culturing, 4 hours in case of PCR. Viability, be aware that if you use PCR, it's DNA that you detect, that you identify. So that DNA can come from live bacteria, but it can also come from dead bacteria. And you don't have the possibility to have a real antimicrobial sensitivity testing in case of real-time PCR, as you have no bacterial growth. So that's, for example, possible if you have bacteriological culturing. You do it via standard culturing or via MALDI-TOF, or even, so in that case, you can do afterwards antimicrobial sensitivity testing, or if you use a system like Mastitis, you have already minimal inhibitory concentration included for 3 antibiotics. In case of real-time PCR, you have the detection of the beta-lactamase gene, but that does not mean that you have also real resistance in practice. And then also price, of course, there we do see some differences. Every method has advantages and disadvantages. Now, what about the practical implementation? Well, I see 4 items: monitoring and testing, prevention, that's also what Joep has been talking about, treatment of clinical mastitis, and then dry cow treatment. Now, treatment of clinical mastitis and dry cow treatment are 2 topics that will be touched upon in the next webinars. So I will not talk about that here in this webinar unless there are any specific questions. I will focus on monitoring and testing, and then also a bit on prevention as a follow-up, as what Joep already explained. So monitoring and testing, 2 levels. We have the herd level and we have the cow level. At the herd level, it is possible to do culturing of the bulk milk, of the bulk tank milk. That's, for example, done in the Netherlands. So the Animal Health Service, Royal GD, they developed a test by which they can identify bacteria in the bulk milk. And as you can see, different bacteria are selected or determined, and then they look whether or not they find colonies, yes or no. They do it every month, for example. That's a regular monitoring of the bulk milk. And then they give a score to each of the bacteria depending on the number of colonies they found. And then we have here also a total score at the end. And you see if it's red, then it means that it's an urgent issue. If it's green, okay, it was maybe positive, but you don't have to worry too much. If it's yellow, then it's somewhere in the middle. But especially the red ones, they need immediate action. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is PCR testing. That's then what is done, for example, in Belgium, if we talk about regular monitoring at the herd level. So again, no culturing, no bacteria, it's just the DNA that we will try to identify. And if you have 3 pluses, then it means that the concentration of DNA, in this case of Streptococcus dysgalaxiae, was already high. So we do not need a lot of cycles to detect DNA at a certain amount. And you see that the number of cycles, which is mentioned here on the right side, is lower for Streptococcus dysgalaxiae than it is, for example, for Klebsiella species. And for Klebsiella species, they come up with a low concentration because we needed more cycles to eventually detect the DNA and to identify DNA of Klebsiella. So that's how it works. So it's also a possibility to do it via PCR if that is available. Now, what is the value of the herd milk analysis? Well, that depends a bit on bacteria. And we have 2 parameters that we take into account. That's the repeatability, which means we have found a certain bacteria or we have detected DNA of a certain bacteria in bulk milk. And if we repeat that on the same farm, we find it again, and also the number of farms. So for example, Streptococcus uberus, yes, it's very repeatable as far as we see now in research. We see that if it was found on a certain farm, that you will find it if you test again. But we also see that a lot of farms are positive for Strep uberus in bulk milk. Also farms that have no issues with mastitis caused by Streptococcus uberus. So that makes that for Strep uberus, the value of a herd level analysis is lower compared or weaker compared to, for example, Mycoplasma and Streptococcus agalactiae. Because there we see that if we find it in bulk milk, that we have a high chance that the farm also have problems with mastitis caused by Mycoplasma and Streptococcus agalactiae, and it's also repeatable. So if we find it on a certain farm, the farm has problem with mastitis, we do another test and we will find it again. So the added value of the herd level analysis is much higher, as you can see, for contagious mastitis pathogens like Mycoplasma, Strep agalactiae, Staph aureus, than it will be, for example, for environmental mastitis pathogens. Because there, the bacteria can also come from, for example, teeth, skin, or hands. It can end up in the milk after the milk was evacuated from the cow. So that's something to take into account. Now, at the cow level, you certainly remember the example in the previous webinar. So a farmer that purchased cows, and not only cows, but also Staphylococcus aureus. And then we see here a huge increase in the herd milk somatic cell count 1 month later because of transmission of those bacteria. Well, at the cow level, you can definitely also test and monitor. And if you have access to PCR, that's excellent, because then you can take individual milk samples of the purchased cows. Maybe you group them per 5, you send them into the lab, they make a pool in the lab, and then if a pool is positive, you can go on with the individual testing, only in the positive pools. That's also possible via culture, but in that way, if you use culture, then I would do immediately individual testing. Maybe you can combine the 4 quarters of one animal, but individual testing and not working in pools. If you work in pools, then it's better to go on with the PCR. Then the fresh cow surveillance is another one, especially on farms that have issues with Staph aureus, Strep agalactiae, for example. Chronically infected cows end up in dry period. Everybody is happy because we see a decrease in the bulk milk somatic cell count, but then those cows will calve again. Most probably they will not be cured, and if you're not careful, they will start spreading again the bacteria in the farm, especially because fresh cows are often milked first, compared to the other cows. So in that case, it's also a good idea to follow the cows that had a high cell count or chronically high cell count before dry off. And then after calving, you can take samples and do PCR or culturing. PCR, the advantage is that you can do it in an early stage. You have less false negative results, and here as well, you can pool again. In case of culturing, then you have more chance of false positive results, and you should definitely wait 3 days and maybe even a bit longer after calving if you don't want to have issues with antimicrobial residues that are still present in the milk sample. But that's definitely a way to use diagnostics when it comes to mastitis management. Then we have decision-making for subclinical mastitis cows. 2 advantages if you take milk samples from cows with subclinical mastitis. First of all, you know what is the bacteria that has caused the high cell count. So what can I do with that cow? Will I treat the cow in lactation? Will I wait until dry off? Is there no need? Is it really a lost case? So I will not do any effort anymore to that cow. That can all be determined based on the culture results. And if you have the culture results and you combine all the culture results of 1 year, for example, for one farm, you can use them as well to adapt the prevention program, more contagious or more environmental. So 2 ways, and it's good. You can say we don't treat animals in lactation, but of course, if a cow has a high cell count and she will not cure herself, what is the other possibility? You don't have many possibilities. If you don't treat in lactation, then you actually decide that she will become chronically infected, and that she will never cure, and yet that in the end that she will need to be killed. So it's always a good idea, especially on farms with a high cell count, to also take milk samples from cows with subclinical mastitis, and then to use that information as well to adapt the prevention program. Some words on prevention. As Joep already explained, contagious environmental. In research, it doesn't seem to be that black and white. It's more a grayscale, as was proposed by Ruud Zadoks from the Netherlands, where we see that, for example, strep ahalaxi, yes, it's almost 100% contagious, although we have to be careful based on the latest research results, but in practice, it's still like that. While, for example, Staph aureus, we can say most strains of Staph aureus will be contagious in nature, but we see that in some cases, some strains might act as an environmental mastitis pathogen. And the same is true for Klebsiella, or the opposite. So we see that most strains of Klebsiella will act as an environmental mastitis pathogen, but some can act more as a contagious one. Now, in practice, I must say that the black-white approach is still a good approach, and we don't really have to worry about this grayscale. The non-aureus staphylococci, that's another question, of course. I will come back to that. But with the non-aureus staphylococci, there we are dealing with a heterogeneous group of staphylococci, and there we see that some are more contagious in nature and others are more environmental in nature. So as Joep explained, if we are talking about contagious mastitis, so transmission is extremely important. If we talk about environmental mastitis, then hygiene, infection pressure, teeth in condition, functioning milking equipment, immunity, that are the elements that definitely need some attention. And as I said, if you culture cows with subclinical mastitis, you can use the data to take a decision for that specific cow. But if you combine them, if you store all those data, then it's also easy to look afterwards, okay, what is now the most common type of bacteria on this particular farm, and then to adapt your prevention program based on the results. So here we see mainly contagious mastitis pathogens. So what happens in the milking parlor, that will be extremely important on this farm. Just a last word on the non-aureus staphylococci. As you can see, we have many species, and this is just a limited version. But if you can work with the Malditoff, then you get also that speciation. So you will not stop with non-aureus staphylococci. No, you will get the exact species. And why can that be important? Well, if we go in research and we look, then we see that some non-aureus staphylococci are mainly isolated from milk. You can find them in the environment, but they are mainly isolated from milk. While others, we see that they are mainly isolated from the environment, but they can cause infection, and they can also be isolated from milk. And then we have also environmental NAS, and there we see that we hardly find them in milk, that they just survive and multiply and grow in environments. So they are not really a cause of other infections, of intramammary infections. Now, as you know, if you take milk samples from cows, you will find major pathogens, but quite some quarters and cows will be infected with non-aureus staphylococci. And then what do? We don't treat them, we just leave the animals like they are. If you, of course, have access to Malditoff, and if you follow this classification, then you can get an impression of what is now the main cause of infections on this farm. Is it contagious, or is it more environmental opportunistic, by using the information of the non-aureus staphylococci? And you find them on every farm. So if you have samples and you can use the Malditoff, then at least they can give you an indication of where to look at in order to further reduce the new infections. Especially on farms that do already quite good job, that have a cell count around 200,000 cells per ml. If you sample cows, you will definitely find a high proportion of non-aureus staphylococci. They don't give a lot of information as group, but if you can go to the species level, like is shown here, then you can get much more information. So some take-home messages before we go to questions and discussion. Different techniques are available. All techniques have advantages and disadvantages. It all depends on resources availability, but also what do you like to do? If you really like to work on farm, you also have to take into account biosecurity. If you're working with bacteria and so on, then it's maybe better not to work with agar plates, but to go, for example, for a Mastitis, where it's an objective measurement. The number of bacteria they detect is maybe more limited than in standard culturing, but you don't have to worry about biosecurity working with live bacteria on a dairy farm. And you don't have to worry about identification because you don't need any background. If you work, of course, if you have access to PCR and you want to have the herd level analysis and monitoring, then that is an excellent tool as well, because you have less false negative results, and especially if you just want to monitor the presence of Strep agalaxy Staph aureus mycoplasma. So every method has its advantages and disadvantages, and it depends on what you really like to do. There are many ways to implement diagnostics. Now I focused on monitoring and testing, and together with you on prevention. But as you will see in the next webinars, you can also use the data to make decisions when it comes to dry cow management, and also make decisions when it comes to treatment of cows with clinical or subclinical mastitis. But that's for the next webinar. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Well done. Any questions, guys? There's one question for you, Sophie, about
Yeah, I see.
PCR bulk milk plus mycoplasma. Is that specific for Mycoplasma bovis or also for other species of mycoplasma?
Yeah. That depends a bit on the system that they use and the kit, but most of the time it's Mycoplasma bovis and then Mycoplasma species for the other ones. So Mycoplasma bovis can be specific in the kit, and then the other ones combined in the group. Yeah. Then can you differentiate lactococci? Yes, you can do so. But then, well, the best way actually to differentiate lactococci from the other esculin positive cocci, like Strep for example, is to use antimicrobial sensitivity testing. And what is typical is that Strep will be resistant to neomycin, while lactococci will be not resistant. So that's one of the easiest ways to make the differentiation based on the antimicrobial resistance pattern. Yeah.
Okay, then Ellen. Hey, Ellen, how are you? Good to see you here. Some concrete floors become very slippery, and especially when you use artificial ventilation. Yeah? Another question was already that if I put full power fans in my deep beds, everything will blow out and I will lose the bedding, especially with the very dry manure bedding. That's the point, but then you still have to put less power or less ventilation. But you really want to have your barn ventilated. If your floors are getting wet, well, there's 3 things you can do, or 5 things you can do, or maybe even more. But one of the things is wash them and put water on them and make sure they do a better job. Scrape them more often. Some people have drip systems in all the corridors that they can make the floor wet. Another one is grooving the floor, and we have these horrible environmental friendly floors in the Netherlands. They're not very environmental friendly, and they're definitely not cow friendly, and they're far too slippery. It's a disaster. And this is a big thing. It happened for the last 20 years in the Netherlands. A big mistake. The only good floor for a cow is rubber, so that's another of the solutions. So more water to wash them, more often scraping, less powerful wind, groove them, or put rubber on the floors. And that's the last advice is the best, especially when the cows are eating for 6 hours a day. We like to rubberize the floors because then they have grip, and then you need rubber with 4 millimeters sinking in possibility. So soft rubber, top quality rubber, which is quite expensive, but also very friendly for cows. For you, Sophie, best post-dip solutions.
Yeah, that all depends a bit on what you like to achieve. But let's say in general, we make a distinction between the ones that have a large spectrum when it comes to killing bacteria, and then chlor dioxide and iode or iodium are still the most effective ones there. But they can also be the less good or the less soft for the teeth skin. While then chlorhexidine, for example, and lactic acid or products based on that, they are softer for the teeth skin, but the spectrum of bacteria they can kill is a bit lower. And especially one typical example is chlorhexidine and Serratia species. So using chlorhexidine on a farm with Serratia is not the best option. But for the rest, yeah, it's always, I would say, choosing is losing. But in practice, we see that it works well. But if you have dry skin, for example, or the cows are on pasture in summertime, then iodine might be a bit too hard for the teeth skin and might dry the teeth skin even more. Also, if you work with lime in the bedding, that might be a bad combination. But I must honestly say, also in iodine products, there is a huge variation among companies. You see that, yeah, in some cases that it's more or less good for the teeth skin and cause more irritation than in other cases, although it's all iodine that they use. Yeah. So I would say use your eyes. If a farmer wants to change, let him change, but then teeth skin softness, teeth end condition is important, and also then the number of new infections to see whether or not you are able to prevent new infections.
There's 4 more questions for you, Sophie. You'll be very busy in the last 2 minutes of this webinar.
I see on Dirk had another question on the Vetorapid. No, if you do not have sensitivity testing, you will not be able to make the difference between strep uterus and lactococci, but you will be able to make the difference between strep agalaxy, strep disalaxy, and strep uterus. So the lactococci, there you need antimicrobial sensitivity testing, which is possible if you have the culture on your Vetorapid, but it's another step. And the difference you can make based on the available test is strep disalaxy, agalaxy, and strep uterus. Yes, then
maybe one more question, and we'll try to answer all the other questions by email, but because we are running out of time. So Sophie, again, a question for you from Giovanni.
Yes. Do you will start worry with hypervalent? No, I will not immediately start worrying, but it might be an indication that there is an issue with bacteria contagious in nature, and that there is transmission, that fly control might be important, or that it happens early in lactation, because we do not have to underestimate that. I have seen the recent study of Volker Krumker. So quite some heifers calved with an infection, but at day 17, 80% of the infections were caused by bacteria that were not yet present at calving. So in early, sometimes you get the impression the animal was already infected at calving, but it's often that she got infected in early lactation. So we need to take that into account as well. But in case of Staph chromogenes, we have seen that in our research as well, quite a lot of transient infections. If it's a persistent infection, then you can say, okay, we need to do something, especially if you need to have your cell count below 200,000 cells per ml for premiums, for example, then it's better to act early. If you have Staph chromogenes, 2 times cell count remains high, after 3-4 times, then you need to take the decision, will I treat? It can be short treatment, or will I be happy that the cell count remains high? But we have seen the 2 measurements after calving. If you say 1 Staph chromogenes and after 1 month it's still positive, then you don't need to count on cure anymore. So then it's taking a decision. Yeah, but okay. I'm not really worried. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sophie and you, for answering those questions. It's time to close the webinar. Now, again, I'm sorry for not having time to answer all questions, but we'll make sure you will get an answer by email in the coming days. You've been quite a lot to follow us tonight, more than 200 have been said, so thank you so much. It's amazing. We'll be delighted to see you again. So keep posted. We'll be back in February next year for the third webinar.
Hope to see you soon, guys. 2 more lactations with cow signals and Vetoquinol. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.